If you're listening to this podcast and you don't know who Dan Pfeiffer is, I'd love to better understand you. Please drop me an email. Dan Pfeiffer is a giant in the progressive messaging space. Along with many impressive titles under his belt, he worked on the Obama campaign and served as senior advisor and White House communications director for President Obama. He then went on to become an influencer for democracy. My term, don't blame him. He's a best-selling author and a co-host of Pod Save America. He also hosts the podcast Pollercoaster, co-hosts Political Experts React on YouTube, and writes the extremely influential newsletter Messagebox. Needless to say, Dan is a man with a ton of insight into messaging for Democratic campaigns. The primary purpose of Messagebox is creating campaign-style messaging memos for everyday people. Campaign staff and operatives write and receive these all the time, but Dan realized that we can no longer win elections simply relying on campaign staff and operatives. If the Democratic Party wants to win elections at every level of government, we all have to be involved in the process. So in Messagebox, he shares talking points and context around the stories of the day in a way that's useful and relatable, not for full-time Hill staffers, but for anyone who wants to be involved in the march toward progress. Because in his words, quote, this whole election comes down to narrowing the news chasm between what's happening and the voters. I take this message to heart quite literally, post pretty much daily on TikTok, regularly sharing the messages he provides, as well as using his general framing as a starting off point to create additional content for my audience. So Dan, let's start there. You're one person. It makes sense you approach Messagebox and a lot of the work you do nationally, but how do you think the concept of Messagebox can be applied locally? How might it work for down ballot local races?
Sure. I think you nailed that introduction. I would say I would really very much appreciate it. And you get the concept of what I'm trying to do is ultimately we have to rethink communications in the progressive movement. And it is less about a candidate or a campaign or a spokesperson for a campaign delivering a message to the traditional media who then deliver that message to voters, and more about thinking about our audience and our supporters and our volunteers as messengers themselves, who have the ability to amplify those messages, right? In the context of Pod Save America, I am very confident that nearly every person who listens to Pod Save America is a committed Democrat.
Sure.
Now, are all of them definitely voting for Joe Biden this election? Maybe, maybe not, but I'm sure it's like 98%.
Right.
But every one of those people who listens to us has friends and family who fit into the audiences and universes that we need to reach, right? People who voted for Biden in 2020 who are not engaged this time around, or sitting out this election. People are thinking about voting for RFK Jr. or Jill Stein or someone like else. And so how do we translate this locally is, one, it actually works better at scale locally, right? The smaller the audience people you're trying to get, the easier it is than to try to organize 80 million people through that sort of relational organizing. But if you're looking at a much smaller total of voters, it can work great. One of the reasons that led me to start Messagebox is I think that politics is not all national, but become much more national in the last few years as we become more polarized, where I was really struck by school board races in 2020 as, just hearing from school board candidates. A lot of them were subscribers to Messagebox who were dealing with the same thing, no matter where they were. Obviously, there's a set of very local issues about the school budget and teacher pay and, whether, bus routes and all these other things. But many of them were all dealing with these sort of post-pandemic issues, CRT, Republicans pushing CRT and all these critical race theory and all these other things. Sort of demagoguing trans people was becoming a big issue in school races, and that we ought to, there's this sort of a gap in the Democratic consulting infrastructure where we don't give advice on those sorts of, national firms, national operatives don't give that sort of advice to people at the local level. And this was one way to do that.
And so what do you say to somebody, like, obviously this is about creating these like advocates who can go out and like help get that message out. So what do you say to the people who say they, quote, don't know enough? Like they're afraid to talk politics. They don't have like, I don't know what happened 10 years ago. And like, I think your argument is clearly like, that doesn't matter. It's about the future. But like, how do you go about tailoring a message to somebody who's afraid?
I think we have to, as a party, do a better job of giving people training and resources to do this, and thinking creatively about how to foster conversation, right? Because there is this, when we started having this conversation about relational organizing and treating our volunteers as messengers, what that kind of meant for a few years was, we're going to send you graphics to post on Facebook, which that is better than not posting graphics on Facebook. Like, it's just, in general, back in the day, you want to train the algorithm to get engagement from progressive posts as it did from right-wing posts, but that's not a super effective means of persuasion, particularly because a lot of the graphics are national, right? They look very slick. They don't look authentic.
Right.
And so, and now that we have moved in this world where much of the political conversation on the internet is happening on the private internet, right? In group chats, DM groups, WhatsApp, it's now just, you're not broadcasting your message, you're starting a conversation with a set of people. And so what's the right way to do that? And so we have to do a better job of training people to do that and thinking about it, where it's just like, Rob Flaherty, who works for the Biden campaign and heads up all of their digital and relational organizing stuff, says all the time, like if he were, he's on a group chat with a bunch of his friends from high school, he just like put in the Biden jobs chart. Like that's not going to be a particularly effective persuasion mechanism. Right. But if you ask people a question about how they feel, or did you see this article?
Right.
Is a way to do that. And you don't have to know everything or do anything. It's just sharing, because the piece of what I would tell anyone nervous about this is, one, we're not asking you to fight with your MAGA uncle, right? This is not what this is about. This is about getting the people who are choosing not between Joe Biden and Donald Trump necessarily, but between Joe Biden and the couch, and talking about the stakes of the election and doing it honestly and authentically. But research also shows that the trustworthiness of an information is related to the person who shares it, not the original source of that information. So if the person you're sharing it with trusts you, has a relationship with you, they are very likely to trust that information. So you're starting from a foundation of strength in that conversation.
So you brought up training. Where does that training come from in your vision? Like, should this be happening directly from campaigns, from organizations, just friend to friend? Like, how do you envision that?
I think it should be happening from campaigns. Demcast, the organization, does a lot of training for this. The Biden campaign, the DNC, have done some, and I think they will do it at scale. We're thinking about it in the context of Vote Save America. Cool. We work with about how to how to leverage your community. And I just think it's also, the training is as much about helping people understand what we know about how people want to hear information and building confidence in them in doing it, than that there's some perfect message or perfect way of doing it, because there's not. And it's like, what I think makes this sort of model of communicating uncomfortable for a lot of people in in politics at large, frankly, is we're all control freaks, right? Like we think, we poll and we focus groups and we get all these really smart people and we get this exact perfect message and we want to deliver the exact right way. And that's just not how it really works, right? Or how it should work. And we have to be willing to relinquish some control and put some trust in the people who are going to help us to make some decisions based. We'll give them some background information on how to think about it, what we know works, but they know the people they are communicating with, right? Sure. And they're going to have to make some judgments based on the information we've given them about how to do that. What issues, what's the right way to do it, is, what's the right forum for it, what's the right timing for it. And just like, we kind of like let it go, let go of the rope a little bit here.
Okay. And I think it's very interesting as well to talk about the difference between the public versus the private, because I think obviously what like a campaign is doing on Twitter is very different than what the campaign supporters are talking about in Slack channels. So I think that's like a helpful context. What do you think the Democratic Party's brand is, and what would you like the Democratic Party's brand to be?
What is the Democratic Party brand right now? It's a great question. It's really, normally in a presidential election year, I would say it's whatever Joe Biden's brand is, right? It's whatever the nominee's brand. Sure. But what's interesting is the New York Times poll that came out earlier this week is that Democratic Senate candidates are doing better than Biden. And they're particularly doing better with the core components of the Democratic base that have either soured a bit on Biden or migrated somewhat to Trump or somewhere in the middle, right? Basically, if you look at that poll about Ruben Gallego, Bob Casey, Tammy Baldwin, et cetera, they are doing about as well with young voters, Black voters, Hispanic voters as Democrats traditionally do and did in 2022. And those candidates they're not generic Democrats, because Gallego, he's in a high profile race. Sure. Bob Casey's been around for a while, and Tammy Baldwin has won a bunch. Jackie Rosen, maybe a little bit more like a generic Democrat there, because she doesn't have a long history as a statewide elected official, but they're not super well known, and the depth of knowledge about them is probably not extreme. And so the Democratic brand is probably a little bit stronger than we think. Where I think we need to go is, and I would say, and what that I think very sort of broadly means to people, the Democratic brand is that we are more for working and middle class people and tougher on rich people and corporations than the Republicans. We're more for freedom, particularly abortion access. We're more for equality and diversity than Republicans. And with the downsides of that brand in voters is that we are softer on crime and immigration than voters typically want. But I don't think that's accurate interpretations of our policies, but that seems to be what voters think. And we have a little bit of and we're tax and spend, right? That's you still see that in that even though Trump ran up $3 trillion in deficit for his tax cuts, people still trust him more on those issues. And Democrats, and that's kind of been, with some exceptions during the Clinton Obama years, that's been true since the 80s, and that brand sort of exists. Where I think we want to be is that we want to return a little bit to our roots and be more of a party that's welcoming to a broad swath of Americans, even people we don't agree with, that we are fighting for middle and working class people, and that we're fighting for freedom. And freedom includes abortion, access to abortion, who you love, who you marry, which books you read, and like the president does not agree with this, but I would very much include legalization of marijuana in there as ways that I think there's a world in which we can be economically populist and socially libertarian in a way that would be very broadly appealing in this country.
Okay. In your book, Battling the Big Lie, you wrote that, quote, political communications is not public relations. It's not press management. It's information warfare. And if you want to win a war, you need a war footing. Republicans understand this. Too many Democrats don't. We don't have to fight as dirty as the right. We must fight as hard. I'm curious what that looks like to you in this day and age. And if there's anyone you think is doing that well, who is fighting as not as dirty, but as hard as Republicans?
Well, I think Democrats are. So I wrote that book in 2021 in the wake of Trump almost winning, January 6th, the big lie taking hold. And it sort of also came at the end of really 4 to 5 years of post-2016, me going around talking to people in the party, funding the funders, trying to talk about the need for us to build up, to invest in content and progressive media. And this was a moment of massive infusion of cash into progressive causes, into Democratic Party infrastructure, huge investments in organizing, new candidate training, like new important groups sprung up, like Swing Left, Indivisible, or Run for Something, huge investment in technology, to the sense that we had sort of fallen behind at the end of the Obama years to catch up to the Republicans, especially on data. And you could not get anyone to and those things were being where like money was pouring in there, but people were very skeptical about investing in content and progressive media. At the same time, crooked media was started. We started doing Pod Save America. That was part of the vision, was to be able to create some capacity for Democrats to tell our story on our terms to our voters. And since then, and particularly since that book's come out, not necessarily because of the book, but we've seen a real shift in. There's still not enough investment, but you've seen more and more. You've seen things like Courier News sprout up. We've had crooked media. You have these sort of emerging influencers like Brian Tyler Cohen, Mehdi Hassan's new Zateo, exactly. And so we're starting to see more and more people who are taking the reins on here. And that's sort of what I meant, is that we have to. If you lose the information war, you're going to lose the political war, and we have to invest in trying to win that information war and shift our mentality away from this simple idea that we're going to have our message, we're going to tell the press, and the press is going to tell our voters, and to really think about distribution of our message, right? Like, I think I always say that 99% of the conversations in the Democratic Party on messaging are what we're going to say, and 1% are on how we're going to get people to hear it. That number shifted some. It's certainly not to where I think it needs to be, but that's sort of what I mean, is that we have to think that Republicans for a long time thought that have invested really, frankly, billions of dollars and decades into building up a media machine that has helped them tremendously in elections, helps them dictate what is on top of voters' minds, helps them protect their candidates when they get in trouble, push negative stories about our candidates, really influence the election in many, many elections. And we haven't done that. We're starting to invest in that now. And we need more help. We need more money. We need more people in the party, particularly at the top of the party, to understand that this is a priority, right? And the priority means, taking some of the billions of dollars we spend in ads and invest it in content, or run some of those ads on progressive media,
Right.
but also to sort of lay hands on the progressive media infrastructure, right? Like Trump, this is one thing Trump does very well, is he's constantly, when he was president, he was doing interviews with the Federalist, he was doing interviews with Breitbart. He, some right-wing nut writes a book, he tweets about that book, gets it on the bestseller list, which means more right-wing nuts are going to get book contracts. Right. He nurtured the MAGA media ecosystem in ways in which we could see the president and his campaign have gotten much better about that in the last year or so. But we could certainly use more, right? It needs to be a priority for our party.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because I was thinking about it like that quote very much in the specifics of like the campaigns and the official infrastructure, but seeing it like I definitely see crooked media as part of the solution as you lay it out in message box. So it's helpful to hear you talk about like Mehdi Hassam doing it as well and being part of that solution. In battling the big lie, you mentioned that right after President Obama won, you floated the idea of starting a newscast, and that someone else on the team nixed that idea. I'm very interested in that concept. Like, first of all, if you go back in time and do that, would you do it? And then let's start there. If you could go back in time and start a newscast immediately after President Obama won, would you?
I would not have started a newscast as it's like typically understood. Like I thought if we like hired an anchor and we had a news desk set, then I'm not sure that that's what people would want. And I think the blowback would have been tremendous. Right. That
was the pushback in the book, right? That the
pushback in
somebody
the book,
thought the press was going to destroy you for it.
Yeah, and I think that they would have definitely destroyed us for it, and it would not have, we would have ended up starting it and then having to quit it pretty quickly, and it would have been a defeat. What I think we could have done a better job of was think about a way in which we kept a direct line to contextualize, to inform our base and contextualize the news for our base directly. And so that could take the form of, like a periodic set of YouTube videos, or, we have sort of appoint, like he wasn't in the White House at the time, but like David Plouffe, who had this very close relationship, or who's our campaign manager, very close relationship with our base, because he was communicating with them in email and videos during the campaign. Mm-hmm. Like, what if he had kept that up on a weekly basis or a couple times a week, or every time there was big news in the world, he would do a quick video that would explain it to our, understand what it meant, or like how it fit in the context of our campaign promises. On both good news and bad news, right? Like when we were forced to, much to our chagrin, because of the Senate abandoned the public option, like us explaining that directly to our voters and our volunteers would have been better than letting Politico do it, which is kind of how it played out.
So the platforms are obviously imploding, and I'm curious, like, one of my questions is which platforms you're seeing movement on, but I'm also really curious if you were going to do what you just described, like, obviously it wouldn't be David Plouffe, it would be somebody from this administration or somebody, in the Biden sphere. Where would you do that? Would it still be a YouTube channel? Would it be an email? Would it be something else?
I think it'd probably be multi-platform, right? Yeah. I think you would. I think you'd have to do it on TikTok and you'd have to do it on YouTube. And I think our party doesn't pay enough attention to YouTube content. I wrote that whole book and I didn't talk about it enough. And we have all these conversations about TikTok. And we should. It's there for a whole host of reasons.
Sure.
But YouTube is by far the biggest television network in the world. And people are watching it all the time. And the right has done a decent job of have a significant presence there. There's been some very successful efforts from the left side of our party, like Young Turks, the Majority reports like that. But sort of there's been less from the mainstream elements of either progressive media or the Democratic Party. And so I think you'd probably do it YouTube. You'd probably cut it up and get it on TikTok. You do it on Instagram too, in Reels. Like you're obviously running into some challenges with political content promotion on that platform, but you'd still do it, right?
So you'd be less focused on newsletter buildup?
Yeah, I think I would. Yeah, you'd probably have to do all the above, right?
Okay. It's everything, yeah.
Because the newsletter, like there is something incredibly important about building that direct relationship with people that shows up in their inbox. You are not dependent on the algorithm, right? You have this direct channel to X number of people and the ability to reach them pretty simply, right? It's just, you can do a TikTok today and you can get 100,000 views. You can do it tomorrow and you can get 6, right? And newsletter just guarantees that you're going to reach those people. and you're going to get like a 50% open rate, which is on a newsletter is pretty good. Depending on the size of your list, obviously.
Sure.
But I would include newsletter in there as a way to do it. I think Jeff Jackson is a great example of someone who's doing all the platforms in the right way, and he's got some stuff on Substack, he does some stuff on TikToks, he promotes them within each other, and I think there's a model there for sort of any politician.
There's nobody writing political emails that I'm more excited about right now in like elected officials than Jeff Jackson, and I don't understand why more folks haven't like co-opted that sort of like, let me just talk to you like a real person about what I'm actually seeing. Like he has such an interesting view of what's happening in the world that like, even if you read, watch CNN and read the news every day, you're not getting. So I legitimately get excited about emails from him, and I can't say that about enough candidates. Like that way. So, right. I'm being polite, but yes. And he knows that. Like I've talked about him many times. Like I'm a huge fan of what he's doing, and I just don't understand why we're not seeing more of that. I think you brought up Mehdi Hasan as an interesting example, because obviously Crooked went like podcast and then expanded, and he went newsletter and then expanded. He's building his business on Substack, which is pretty fascinating to watch in real time, like how he's like trying to build an audience using his Twitter and using his other things, but he's really going Substack first, which I'll be curious to see what that looks like in a year.
I mean, Bulwark is now on Substack full time, basically, because they were doing their newsletters before in their podcast episode, but now they're doing it all on the Sub. They moved the whole thing to the Substack platform.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, that's cool.
And we went podcast because I could pretend that there was some giant strategy. Just happened to be that we had been doing a podcast for The Ringer that had a pretty decent sized audience, and so
keeping it 1,600, right?
Keep it 1,600, and so we went from that podcast to a new podcast, and podcast was. I mean, there's also business choices that, and this is how you end up with newsletters now. Is podcast is a very depending on how you do it, low overhead advertising business where if you have an audience, you can make money and be profitable quickly, which is what Crooked did. Substack and newsletters are the similar way, right? If you can build an audience quickly and you can monetize that audience, you can do it. Substack takes care of a lot of the back end for you in a really just you can get up and running really fast, right? Which is you can Substack little, and this is true of Beehive and some other newsletter platforms, but you can have the idea to start the newsletter today and you can start monetizing it tomorrow.
Right. It's a pretty amazing update for newsletters for sure.
Right. And so you're not in a situation where you're like building website and building, you're sourcing a email client and doing all these other, and a podcast client, all these other things. You just sat there and it's cost $0 to start. Right. And so on those platforms. And then, as you build, it'll cost you more, they're going to take a cut. It'll cost you more money as you hire staff, but you can get going quickly. And so it was smart of Mehdi to do it that way.
Yeah, no, I'm very
platform really in existence when we started Crooked 8 years ago.
Right. You would have been having to like duct tape things together to make it work in the same way. So speaking of email, thoughts on spam packs and what the Democratic Party can do about them?
I think about this all the time.
Me too.
And it's hard because like there's a world in which like one idea I've had is that like the DNC or someone could do like a charity navigator type situation but I worry about that because you're in situations where like not too long ago the DCCC was blacklisting consultants who worked for primary challengers, and so like should Justice Democrats be on a list of approved legitimate groups? Absolutely. Would they be one that a party organ would necessarily sign off on? Maybe not.
Right.
I do think that politicians themselves could be more aggressive about scam packs using their names. Because the amount of ones I get that's like Barack Obama warned us, and then it's like Obama's image, and you could get some lawyers sending cease and desist letters pretty quickly to try to hone that in or to publicly call out those groups in a way to sort of shame them.
Or the Trump model and take 5%, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like one today that was can't even remember what it was, but it was something. We're New York Times Siena poll we're putting in place a 700% match, right? And it's so bad, but for a lot of donors, they just have no way, the vast majority, to distinguish between the DSCC and a scam pack, right? Or a candidate that we legitimately need and think can win, and one who has absolutely no shot of winning, but is running against, pick your MAGA.
Right.
This is one of the things that Vote Save America is doing is, and I think more people with followings could do, is say, here's our list, right? Or come to us and we're gonna have an approved group of people that we're gonna create a fund for what we believe to be it's not complicated when you say the most important Senate races or the most important House races, because there's like public lists of that. But we did a project in 2018 and 2022 with Civis, where we figured out what races would get the most impact from more money, right? Looking at like how people are funded, where are the ones that are like just outside of, are still winnable, but aren't as well funded. Like, can we suggest people give there? And so I think you could do a little more, so people could do more curation. I don't know how to stop these groups because they're scam packs, so they're not following any rules.
Right, they're doing whatever they want.
And one thing I think we could also do a better job is what is tough is I think when legitimate organizations and candidates have scam packy like language, and that makes it really hard to distinguish between what's real and what's not, right? And there are a lot of really good, we're such a prisoner's dilemma problem on this because the good actors are being penalized for the work of the bad actors, right? Because you're getting a gazillion texts, a lot, and a lot of them don't really they say stop to end, but stop doesn't end it.
Doesn't end it. Nope.
And so, it's like the Biden folks are pretty darn responsible in how they use their list.
I agree, for sure.
These people are, and I think the DSCC is pretty responsible. There are some other groups that are less responsible in the framework of the party, and it gives people like the icks about donating to the party, and that affects a lot of people. So I wish I had a good answer. I don't.
It's an important topic, and I know everyone in like my world is talking about it, and I imagine in yours as well. So I'm just curious to hear it. So I actually got kind of my political start with Organizing for Action, which obviously was the Obama for America campaign converted in. And they were a C4, and then they sort of disappeared. And I'm curious, what should have happened to OFA in your opinion? It was this powerhouse of an organization. I still meet people in Madison, Wisconsin who are in their like Obama teams from 2008, and they still talk about going to meetings. And I'm like, man, if only that, was there some way to keep that infrastructure in place that could have like continued on? And I guess the question is, was there, and what could it have been? What should it have been?
I think there is a way it could have happened, but it would have sort of violated all the norms of the time. Like what Obama probably should have done was just file for re-election on the inauguration day, like Trump did, continue to raise money directly into a campaign and keep the same infrastructure in place, right? Keep Mitch Stewart and Jeremy Byrd running it out of the campaign with a direct relationship with Obama. And that just that is acceptable now. That did not seem acceptable in 2009 in the middle of a financial crisis when the economy was collapsing. And so the only thing that sort of made sense was to move it into the DNC. And there were all kinds of like very complicated campaign finance reasons about why that had to be, but that ended up turning off some people. And you know what,
it got like enveloped into the
inside
DNC?
the party. It was part of the party. Because a lot of these folks were what brought them. They had no interest or involvement in the Democratic Party before Obama. Like they were in it for Obama. And so the idea that they now were part of the official Democratic Party, they thought, not entirely correctly, but not totally correctly, that was trying to beat Obama in the primaries. And so like that didn't sit well.
Right.
And then you did get it. Like, this is the hard part about I don't have a solution to this part, but this is the hard part about being president was we had all these folks who were, volunteers and organizers around the country who were trying to help Obama. And when we were trying to pass the Affordable Care Act, we had these people who were protesting Democratic senators and Democratic representatives who had not yet committed to support the ACA. And I remember going to Senate caucus lunch when I was working in the White House and just getting absolutely reamed by like 15 different senators about, these groups they're Obama volunteers. It wasn't like the OFA leadership said, go do this, but they were trying to help Obama. And it's hard to be the head of the party and the head of an organization that exists outside the party at the same time. But if it was, I think the best version of it would have been to just keep organizing for Barack Obama's reelection. as the way to keep that group engaged. And you could do stuff around sort of the legislative agenda and that stuff. It's just what became hard was politics was so polarized and everything was so gerrymandered that it wasn't the best use of time to send people to, do a, visibility outside of some Republican congressman's office who was in an R+10 district who was more afraid of his primary than his general.
Right.
But I think just if we had kept it together under the auspices of the campaign, it might have had the most chance for success. It's hard to imagine how that would have gone down in 2009. In 2024, you could absolutely do that. 2009, I imagine that would have been poorly received by folks.
Yeah.
Maybe it would have been worth the churn to do that, but it didn't seem like a viable option back then.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And yeah, I hadn't really connected the dots between that and the fact that like Trump broke yet another norm and just said, I'm campaigning again today. So like it gave him like the ability to do things that like traditionally a president wouldn't be able to do. So that's an interesting connection that like hindsight's 2020 or whatever, I don't know, but it's an interesting concept. Anything else? So Crooked, I'm a huge fan of Crooked, big fan of a lot of what they're doing. Do you want to talk about the Organizer Else campaign or any of the other awesome programs coming out of there?
Yeah, so Vote Save America, for those who don't know, is an organization that Crooked set up back in 2018. We recruit volunteers, we connect that. We recruit anyone who wants to channel their anxiety or excitement into action. Come to Vote Save America. We will help you know what's on your ballot. We will help you know, we will connect you with, it's a place where you can go just for basic electoral information like voter registration deadlines, absentee ballot deadlines. We will connect you with volunteer opportunities. We will have a curated list of places you can donate to. We have a recurring fund that you can start now. It's called the Anxiety Relief Fund, where you can contribute, and then we will make sure that your donation goes to a curated list of grassroots organizations around the country in battleground states that we have looked at their work. We've decided that they are run by the right people. They're doing the right work. They are contributing to what we care about, and we will funnel that. You don't have. We'll even report everything that's happening. But you don't have to you can give to that and turn your spam filter on for other stuff if you want. And Organizer Else campaign launched this about a week ago. We are recruiting volunteers and activists to join the community. We have two teams. We have East and West. We're competing against each other. I am along with Tommy Vitor, the captain of the East team. John Favreau and John Lovett are captain of the West team. And you sign up and you will get connected with opportunities in your area with things that you're comfortable doing, right? We're not going to make you do anything you don't want to do. If you are someone who likes some outdoors, you do that. If you're someone who prefer to text, we'll do that. So maybe some people want to write postcards. We'll help you figure that out. And we'll let you know about the sort of the races and opportunities in your area or in issues that you care about where you can have the most impact. And so votesaveamerica.com, come check it out.
Yeah, cool. You want to make news today and announce you're running for Senate by chance?
I am definitely not running for Senate.
Too bad.
We have great candidate in Delaware.
Yeah, we do.
Running, and I haven't been home in a long time, so my residency is here in California right now. Much to my mom's chagrin, this is where I'll be.
That Senate seat is definitely crowded.
Yes.
How can folks connect with you? Where are you hanging out these days online? Where do you want to connect with folks?
I'm still on Twitter at Dan Pfeiffer. I post less these days, as most of us do, but I am there and I still read it. And Substack, my message box newsletter is at messagebox.substack.com. I'm also on Instagram, but I don't really do that much political stuff there. So Twitter and Substack are probably the best places.
Cool. And I'll have links to all that stuff. Like Dan mentioned, a ton of resources. That'll all be in the show notes as well as his social handles and stuff. Thank you so much. I hope this is helpful for folks, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Awesome, Josh. Great to see you.
Thanks, man.